Imagine setting sail on a vast, uncharted ocean, knowing you won't see land for months, maybe even years. Your ship is your entire world, carrying everything needed to survive storms, scurvy, and the sheer unknown. This wasn't some fantasy adventure. It was daily reality for explorers like Ferdinand Magellan and Captain James Cook, who ventured into waters where maps simply ended. We often marvel at their courage and discoveries, but we rarely stop to think about the practical miracle happening right under their feet. How did these pioneers possibly pack for voyages that stretched across years and continents, with no resupply stations, no modern forecasting, and no guarantee they'd ever return? What went into those wooden chests and barrels that could sustain human life through such epic journeys? It's one of history's great silent puzzles, the art and science of packing for the impossible. We're not talking about tossing a toothbrush and a change of clothes into a backpack. This was about precision, foresight, and sometimes pure gamble. Every item loaded onto those creaking ships had to earn its place. A single miscalculation, too little flour, not enough nails, the wrong kind of rope could doom an entire crew. And it wasn't just about survival. Explorers also carried gifts for foreign rulers, tools for mapping new lands, scientific instruments, trade goods, and even items to maintain morale during those long, isolating months at sea. Their packing lists were lifelines, narratives of hope and desperation etched in ink and inventory. So today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of history's most fascinating logistical challenges. We'll explore how these women and men made the unimaginable possible. From clever space-saving tricks to the heartbreaking choices of what to leave behind, we're diving deep into the minds and methods of the world's greatest explorers. You'll discover how they balanced practicality with ambition, and how something as humble as a barrel of sauerkraut or a carefully sealed crate of lemon juice changed the course of human exploration. This is more than a history lesson. It's a window into human ingenuity itself. So come aboard as we unravel the mysteries stowed away in the holds of some of history's most legendary ships. The sheer scale of these journeys is almost impossible to overstate. We're talking about voyages planned to last for years, not months, into a void on the map simply labeled Terra Incognita, unknown land. There were no ports to restock at, no friendly villages to trade with once they left familiar coastlines. Every single item, from the largest sail to the smallest nail, had to be calculated, procured, and crammed into the wooden hull before they ever cast off. This meant provisioning for scenarios they couldn't even predict. Would they find fresh water? Would the local wildlife be edible? Could the natives be hostile or friendly? Their packing lists were a series of educated guesses against the vast unknown. This immense uncertainty directly shaped every single decision. Take maps, or more accurately, the lack of them. Explorers often sailed with charts that were half hearsay, half fantasy, depicting sea monsters and land masses that simply didn't exist. This meant they couldn't just pack for a direct route. They had to prepare for endless detours, for being lost for weeks on end, for circumnavigating continents they didn't know were there. This led to the single most critical calculation: food and water. A ship could carry only so much. Rations were meticulously measured out per man per day. But what happened when the voyage dragged on twice as long as planned? The specter of starvation was a constant companion, a grim reality that forced captains to make brutal choices long before they ever set sail. Then there was the silent, creeping killer that no amount of bravery could deter: scurvy. For centuries, this disease was the ghost haunting every long voyage, weakening crews, causing old wounds to reopen, and leading to a slow, painful death. It was a mysterious affliction, and while they didn't understand the science of vitamin C, observant captains noticed patterns. Ships that carried certain provisions fared better. This is where packing became a life or death science. Was it worth the immense space and weight to carry barrels of citrus juice, even though it might spoil? Could they pack enough onions or pickled cabbage, known as sauerkraut, which seemed to have some protective effect? The choice to allocate precious cargo space to these anti-scorbutics, as they were called, was one of the most crucial logistical decisions an expedition leader could make, often meaning the difference between a victorious return and a ship becoming a floating tomb. Beyond the human element, the ships themselves were vulnerable. They were sailing into weather systems they had no data on, facing hurricanes, doldrums, and ice flows they couldn't anticipate. This meant spare parts were absolutely vital. A broken mast or a torn sail in the middle of an ocean wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. So the holds were packed with extra timber, cordage of every thickness, tar for sealing leaks, and countless forged iron nails and fittings. A ship had to be its own floating repair shop, able to rebuild itself far from any harbor. Each of these items, heavy and bulky, was a trade-off against food or water. A constant balancing act between the need to stay afloat and the need to stay alive. And with every decision hanging in that delicate balance between space and survival, nothing weighed more heavily on a captain's mind than the question of food. You can carry extra sails and spare timber, but you can't carry an infinite supply of meals. Food spoils, it rots, it attracts vermin, and it simply runs out. This fundamental problem forced explorers to become masters of food preservation centuries before refrigeration. The hold of an exploration vessel was a testament to human ingenuity in the face of decay, a carefully curated museum of long-lasting sustenance. The absolute cornerstone of the sailor's diet was salt meat. Enormous barrels were packed with beef or pork, heavily layered with coarse sea salt. This process, called salting or curing, drew the moisture out of the meat, creating an environment where bacteria couldn't thrive. But this wasn't a gourmet technique, it was a brutal necessity. The result was a tough, leathery substance that had to be soaked for hours and then boiled to become even remotely palatable. The constant taste of salt permeated everything, and the nutritional value was questionable at best, but it provided crucial protein that wouldn't spoil for months, even years at sea. Alongside the salt meat sat another key player, the humble but mighty barrel of pickled vegetables. Cabbage, in particular, was transformed into sauerkraut through a process of fermentation. While sailors didn't understand the science of probiotics or vitamin C, astute captains like James Cook became staunch advocates for it. He insisted on large stores of sauerkraut for his crews, and his voyages were famously free of scurvy. The acidic, tangy preserve not only added variety to a monotonous diet, but also delivered those essential nutrients that kept debilitating illness at bay. Onions, too, were often pickled and stored, providing another layer of defense against disease and a welcome burst of flavor. But if there was one food item that truly defined the age of sail, it was hardtack. Also known as ship's biscuit, this was the ultimate space-saving, non-perishable carbohydrate. Making it was a simple, almost brutal process, just flour and water, mixed into a stiff dough, rolled flat, and baked until all moisture was utterly driven out. The result was a rock-hard, nearly indestructible slab of sustenance. It was so durable that it was often infested with weevils, leading sailors to develop the habit of tapping their biscuit on the table to dislodge the bugs before eating. To actually consume it, a man couldn't simply take a bite. He'd need a hammer to break off pieces, which were then often soaked in the watery gruel of the day's meal or even in brine to soften them into something edible. It was bland, it was tough, and it was often crawling with pests, but hardtack was the reliable, if unlovable, foundation that fueled discovery, one jaw-breaking mouthful at a time. Yet for all their ingenuity with solid food, none of it mattered without something even more fundamental to life: fresh water. A ship could carry enough hardtack to last a year, but without drinkable water, the entire crew would perish in a matter of days. Storing this liquid lifeline presented one of the voyage's most persistent and dangerous challenges. The primary method was the wooden cask, enormous barrels crafted by skilled coopers. While effective containers, wood is porous and absorbs flavors. Over weeks and months at sea, the water inside would slowly stagnate. Algae would bloom, turning the water slimy and green. Bacteria would thrive, creating a foul-smelling brew that was barely recognizable as drinking water. A sailor might open a cask only to find it teeming with wriggling insects or other contaminants that had seeped in. Drinking this could and often did lead to devastating outbreaks of dysentery and cholera, diseases that could decimate a crew as effectively as any storm. This constant threat of contamination forced a radical solution. If the water itself was unsafe, they would need to mix it with something that could purify it, or at the very least, make it palatable. This is where alcohol became not a luxury, but a critical component of survival logistics. Explorers discovered that adding alcohol to tainted water could kill some of the bacteria, and the strong flavor effectively masked the horrible taste of algae and rot. Nearly every major European exploring power adopted this practice. The Spanish and Portuguese ships were typically laden with wine, while the British Navy famously relied on beer. This wasn't the high-alcohol beer we know today, but a much weaker, slightly alcoholic brew called small beer. It was brewed specifically for long voyages, as the fermentation process and the alcohol content helped prevent the growth of pathogens that would spoil water. For a British sailor in the 18th century, his official daily ration could include a staggering gallon of this beer. Imagine that, 8 pints a day, not for celebration, but for basic hydration and survival. As voyages stretched into years and the beer inevitably ran out, ships would switch to stronger spirits. Rum, particularly in the British Navy, became the gold standard. It was more compact, had a much longer shelf life than beer, and could be easily mixed with the failing water supplies to make them drinkable. This practice of adding a shot of rum to a sailor's water ration was known as grog, and it was a meticulously regulated part of shipboard life. The alcohol did more than just sanitize, it served as a crucial morale booster. In the face of back-breaking labor, terrifying storms, and relentless monotony, the daily ration of alcohol was a small comfort, a tiny piece of normalcy and warmth that crews clung to. So central was this liquid sustenance that the loss of a ship's alcohol stores was considered a catastrophe on par with losing food or sails, a sure path to a disheartened and dehydrated crew. But while food and drink kept the body going, it was the navigator's tools that guided the soul. Stowed away in the captain's cabin, protected like the crown jewels, were the instruments that literally charted the course of history. In an age without satellites or GPS, these delicate devices of brass and wood were the only things standing between a ship and a catastrophic fate on an unseen reef. They were the era's most advanced technology, and packing them required as much care as packing the gunpowder itself. The most vital of these was the astrolabe, an ancient instrument that allowed a navigator to calculate latitude by measuring the angle of the sun or a star above the horizon. It was a beautiful, intricate disc of brass, engraved with complex scales and charts, but its beauty belied a serious practical weakness. Using it on the rolling deck of a ship was notoriously difficult. A navigator had to hold it perfectly level to get an accurate reading, a near impossible task in heavy seas. To protect this essential but fragile tool, it was kept in a specially crafted wooden box, lined with soft velvet or wool to cushion it from the constant jostling and the corrosive salt air that could tarnish its finely marked scales. To solve the problem of the astrolabe's instability, explorers began packing more user-friendly instruments. The cross staff and its later evolution, the backstaff, were simpler in design. They allowed a navigator to measure the sun's height by casting a shadow, meaning he could actually turn his back to the blinding glare, a welcome relief. These tools were still made of wood and required precision, so they too were stored in custom-fitted cases. The protection wasn't just about preventing breakage, it was about preserving absolute accuracy. A warp in the wood or a dent in the alignment could throw off a reading by miles, potentially leading an entire expedition astray. The ultimate evolution of these celestial tools was the sextant, a masterpiece of engineering that combined mirrors and optics to achieve unparalleled precision in measuring angles between celestial objects. Appearing in the mid-18th century, it revolutionized navigation. A sextant was a treasured possession, often personally owned by the captain or chief navigator. Its case was its fortress, typically made of polished mahogany with brass fittings. and inside, the instrument itself was nestled in a precise bed of form-fitting cutouts, sometimes even with a small lid of glass to allow it to be checked without being exposed to the damaging elements. This wasn't mere storage, it was a ritual of preservation for the most important object on the ship after the rudder itself. Yet knowing your latitude, your north-south position was only half the puzzle. The true holy grail for explorers was finding longitude, their east-west position. For centuries, this was an unsolvable riddle that cost countless ships and lives. The breakthrough finally came with John Harrison's marine chronometer in the 1700s. This was not just an instrument, it was a mechanical marvel, a clock of such incredible accuracy that it could keep precise time even on a tumultuous, months-long ocean voyage. By comparing the local time, determined by the sun, with the exact time at a home port like Greenwich, a navigator could finally calculate longitude. This single invention made the world's oceans infinitely safer. And given its immense value and fragility, the chronometer was packed with more care than anything else. It was suspended in a swiveling gimbal within its own dedicated box, a system designed to keep it perfectly level through the wildest pitches and rolls of the ship, protecting its delicate balance wheels and springs from the forces that could destroy it. The safe arrival of a ship's chronometer in port was a cause for celebration, as it meant the entire voyage's navigational data was sound. Yet even with the most precise navigation, an explorer's greatest fear was not getting lost, but what, or who, they might find. Venturing into uncharted territory meant entering a world of complete uncertainty. Were the native inhabitants friendly traders or hostile warriors? Were the waters patrolled by rival empires or ruthless pirates? A ship was not just a vessel of discovery, it was a floating fortress, and its arsenal was as carefully considered as its food stores. Every cannon, every musket, and every barrel of gunpowder was a grim necessity, a heavy investment in security that took up precious space which could have been used for extra rations or trade goods. The primary line of defense was, without question, the ship's cannons. These were not the massive guns of a first-rate warship, but a carefully chosen battery of smaller, more versatile cannons that could serve multiple purposes. They were crucial for intimidating potential threats, firing warning shots across the bow of an unfamiliar vessel, or defending the ship in a full-blown naval engagement. But their use extended beyond combat. A loud cannon blast was an effective way to signal another ship in the fog, or to scare off curious but dangerous wildlife. The sound alone could reverberate across a silent bay, announcing their arrival in a way that was impossible to ignore. Storing the shot for these cannons was a weighty dilemma, literally. Iron cannonballs were tremendously heavy, and captains had to strike a balance between having enough for a protracted fight and not weighing the ship down so much that it became sluggish and slow. For engagements on land or closer range, the crew relied on personal firearms. A typical arsenal included sturdy, reliable muskets. These were the workhorses of the expedition, used for everything from hunting large game to repelling boarders. They were often accompanied by a selection of pistols, prized for their portability in close quarters, but these weapons were notoriously inaccurate and slow to reload. In a tense standoff on a beach, a sailor might only get one chance to fire his musket before having to resort to his sidearm or something far more personal. The real challenge was keeping the one thing that made them all work perfectly dry: gunpowder. Moisture was its mortal enemy, rendering it useless. This meant gunpowder was stored in tightly sealed wooden barrels, often lined with cloth or leather and kept in the driest part of the ship, frequently near the galley fire to benefit from any residual heat. The ship's cooper, the barrel maker, was one of its most vital crew members, as his skill in making these containers watertight was quite literally a matter of life and death. When firearms failed or the fighting became too close for them to be effective, explorers turned to centuries-old bladed weapons. The cutlass was a standard issue for navies around the world. Its short, heavy, curved blade was perfectly designed for the chaotic, tight confines of a ship's deck, allowing for powerful, slashing attacks without getting caught in rigging. It was a brutal, efficient tool for close combat, Many explorers also carried long knives or hunting swords, which served a dual purpose. While they could be used in a fight, they were just as vital for butchering a freshly killed animal, cutting through dense jungle undergrowth, or 100 other daily survival tasks. This blurring of the line between tool and weapon highlights the practical mindset of these voyages. Every item had to pull its weight in multiple ways. Ultimately, this formidable arsenal was about more than just domination. It was about deterrence and bargaining. The display of military power was often a language in itself. Firing a cannon into the air could be a show of respect or a warning, depending on the context. Trading a musket to a local leader could forge a powerful alliance, while brandishing a cutlass might diffuse a situation without a single blow being struck. The weapons were a key part of the complex diplomacy of first contact, a tangible representation of the ship's strength and the consequences of crossing it. They were a heavy, dangerous, but indispensable insurance policy for venturing into the blank spaces on the map. But for all the cannons and cutlasses designed to command respect, some of the most powerful items in the ship's hold were those intended for peaceful exchange. Tucked away in carefully packed crates were the true currency of exploration. Trade goods, to our modern eyes, many of these items might seem laughably simple colorful glass beads, small mirrors, cheap bells, bolts of ordinary cloth, and basic iron tools like nails and knives. Yet in the context of these first encounters, these objects held a power far greater than chests of gold or silver. They were the keys that could unlock goodwill, secure essential supplies, and ultimately determine whether an expedition was greeted with curiosity or with hostility. The brilliance of this strategy lay in its understanding of perceived value. European explorers quickly learned that precious metals, which they themselves coveted, often held little intrinsic worth to the diverse cultures they met. A society that crafted intricate jewelry from local materials might see a gold coin as a shiny but useless trinket. However, a simple iron nail was a revelation. For cultures working primarily with stone, bone, or wood, a metal tool was a marvel of durability and sharpness. A single iron axe head could transform a day's worth of labor, making it an object of immense practical value and desire. Similarly, a large bolt of bright red cloth was a stunning spectacle for people who relied on labor-intensive natural dyes. It represented status, beauty, and a material entirely novel to their experience. The explorers weren't just offloading cheap goods, they were offering revolutionary technology and luxury items. This system of trade became the lifeblood of long voyages. A ship's provisions, no matter how carefully calculated, would inevitably run low. The ability to barter for fresh food was often the difference between a healthy crew and one succumbing to scurvy and malnutrition. A handful of beads could secure a basket of fresh fruit. A few iron fish hooks might be traded for a haul of seafood. A mirror could purchase clean drinking water from a fresh spring. These exchanges provided vital nutrients that the ship's stores of salt pork and hardtack simply could not offer, revitalizing crews that had been weakened by months at sea. Beyond mere sustenance, this trade was the primary mechanism for building the fragile bridges of diplomacy. Presenting gifts to a local leader was a near-universal gesture of peace. Offering a prized item without an immediate demand for something in return demonstrated respect and a desire for friendship, establishing a foundation of trust that was essential for gathering information. And information was perhaps the most valuable commodity of all. Explorers were sailing into the absolute unknown, and local knowledge was their only reliable map. A willingness to trade fairly could convince a community to share crucial intelligence about the coastline ahead, the location of hidden reefs, safe anchorages, dangerous currents, or fresh water sources. They could learn about seasonal weather patterns, identify which plants were edible and which were poisonous, and even get directions to the next populated area. This local guidance saved countless expeditions from disaster and opened up routes that would have remained hidden for years. The humble trade good, therefore, wasn't just a tool for survival. It was the essential instrument for discovery itself, transforming strangers into guides and hostile shores into waypoints on the map of the world. Yet for all the external threats of conflict and hunger, the most persistent danger on any long voyage was an invisible one, festering within the crew itself: disease and injury. A ship at sea was a sealed environment, a petri dish of filth and close quarters where a single infected wound or a contagious illness could race through the entire population in a matter of days. The ship's surgeon, often a man with more practical experience than formal education, was the crew's last line of defense against a host of medical horrors, armed with a kit of supplies that was as terrifying as it was limited. The cornerstone of his arsenal was a set of lancets for the practice of bloodletting, based on the ancient humoral theory that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids. The surgeon would open a vein to drain what was believed to be excess or bad blood. This was a standard treatment for everything from fever and infection to simple fatigue, a practice that undoubtedly weakened already suffering patients and hastened the deaths of many. Alongside the lancets were tools for more direct interventions: amputation saws, often resembling a common woodworking tool, and cattling knives for cutting through flesh and muscle. These instruments were crude and rarely cleaned beyond a quick wipe on a soiled apron, making infection a near certainty after any procedure. For pain management, the options were dire. The most powerful analgesic available was laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. It could dull agony and induce sleep, but its effects were unpredictable and addiction was a common, debilitating side effect. Beyond that, a patient might be given a thick leather strap to bite down on or a strong swig of rum. There was no true anesthesia. Surgery was an exercise in brutality and speed, with the surgeon needing to work fast to minimize the time a man spent in unimaginable pain and to reduce his blood loss. A limb amputation, for instance, needed to be completed in under a minute to give the patient any hope of survival. The sounds of a surgery, the screams, the grating of the saw on bone, were a haunting reality of life at sea. Alongside these harsh tools, the surgeon also relied on a pharmacopoeia of herbal remedies, a blend of folk wisdom and hopeful guesswork. He might have jars of dried herbs like chamomile for calm, peppermint for digestion, or more potent substances like mercury, which was used to treat syphilis with devastatingly toxic side effects. Poultices made from moldy bread or moss were applied to wounds, an accidental and ineffective precursor to antibiotics. The true miracle cure, though it was often overlooked for centuries, was already present in the hold. Citrus juice was the ultimate defense against scurvy, but the medical establishment was slow to accept this simple solution. It took determined advocates like James Cook, who enforced a strict regimen of sauerkraut and citrus wort, to prove its efficacy. Even then, the knowledge was frequently ignored, and countless men continued to die from a preventable disease because the medical thinking of the time was trapped in tradition. The surgeon's cabin was therefore a place of stark contrasts, a repository of both ancient superstition and the first glimmers of true medical science, where a man's fate often depended more on luck and his own constitution than on the contents of the medicine chest. While the ship's hold was a marvel of collective survival, packed with the tools of navigation and barrels of sustenance, the world of the individual sailor was far more intimate and unforgiving. His entire universe was the clothes on his back and the tiny, precious collection of personal items he could fit into a small sea chest. In an era where fashion was secondary to sheer resilience, the concept of packing for a voyage was a lesson in prioritizing durability over any notion of comfort. The primary defense against the harsh marine environment was wool. Sailors wore layers of woolen garments, itchy, heavy, and far from luxurious, but possessing one miraculous property: wool retains its insulating ability even when soaking wet. In the North Atlantic gales or the drenching spray of the Southern Ocean, a soaked cotton shirt would leach warmth from the body, leading to a rapid and deadly loss of core temperature. A woolen jersey, however, would trap a layer of water next to the skin that the body could gradually warm, providing a critical buffer against hypothermia. Their trousers were often made of canvas or thick, coarse wool, designed to withstand the abrasive surfaces of ropes, decks, and cargo. Footwear was equally practical. Leather boots, treated with animal fat or tar to make them somewhat water-resistant, were essential for working on wet, slippery decks. Yet, they were a mixed blessing. Once seawater inevitably seeped in, they would stay wet for days, leading to a constant, painful condition known as immersion foot. The final layer of protection was the oilskin coat, a heavy canvas jacket painted with linseed oil to create a barrier against wind and spray. Stiff, smelly, and far from breathable, it was nonetheless a vital piece of gear that made standing watch in a storm marginally more bearable. Beyond this standard-issue practicality, a sailor's identity and sanity were often tied to the few personal treasures he managed to bring aboard. Space was ruthlessly limited, so every item had to justify its presence. For many, the most valued possession was a small, lockable wooden chest. Inside, they might keep the fragile remnants of their life on land, a bundle of letters from a sweetheart or family, carefully folded and reread until the paper softened at the creases. A small Bible or a book of prayers offered spiritual comfort in the face of daily peril. For the literate, a journal and a pencil provided an outlet to process the overwhelming experiences, a private record of a world few would ever see. To combat the soul-crushing monotony of the long stretches between ports, men brought tools for creativity. A well-crafted knife wasn't just a utility blade, it was an instrument for whittling. Scraps of wood from broken cargo crates or bits of whalebone were transformed into intricate models of ships, chess pieces, or small figures. This practice, known as scrimshaw, was more than a hobby. It was a form of meditation, a way to focus the mind and keep despair at bay through the satisfaction of creation. Music, too, was a cherished escape. A reasonably skilled man might pack a flute, a fiddle, or a small concertina. The sound of a familiar tune played on a quiet evening could lift the spirits of the entire crew, forging a temporary bond of shared humanity that transcended the harsh hierarchy of shipboard life. These personal effects were not mere luxuries. They were psychological lifelines, tiny anchors to a world of emotion and individuality in an environment that demanded absolute conformity and physical endurance. They were a silent rebellion against the anonymity of the sea, a way for a man to remember who he was, even when he was thousands of miles from anyone who knew his name. Yet even the sturdiest ship, packed with the best provisions and navigational tools, was utterly vulnerable to the relentless punishment of the sea. A vessel wasn't just a transport, it was a complex machine of wood, rope, and canvas, and every single component was under constant attack. The stress of towering waves could loosen hull planks, creating deadly leaks. The endless friction of rigging could wear through the thickest ropes in a matter of months. A sudden squall could shred a vital sail or, in the worst-case scenario, snap a mast entirely. In the middle of a vast ocean, there was no tow truck, no dry dock, no shipyard to limp into. The crew's survival depended entirely on their ability to become a floating workshop, making repairs with only the materials they had the foresight to bring. This meant the ship's hold was essentially a mobile lumberyard and hardware store, a carefully curated collection of potential solutions to disasters they could only imagine. The most critical and bulky of these supplies was spare timber. Captains had to anticipate the catastrophic failure of major structural members. This meant carrying entire replacement masts, yards, and booms. These were not small items. A main mast for a large exploration vessel could be over 100 feet tall and weigh several tons. They were stored lashed to the deck or even suspended along the side of the ship, a constant reminder of the fragility of their wooden world. Beyond these giant spars, the hold was packed with a library of pre-cut planks in various lengths and thicknesses. These were for patching the hull after a collision with a reef or a rogue piece of driftwood, a repair that had to be done from the outside, often with a sailor working from a precarious raft or even underwater, hammering in new boards to stem the inflow of the ocean itself. Alongside the wood was the ship's textile department, spare canvas for sails. A full suit of sails represented thousands of hours of skilled labor, and they were the engine of the entire voyage. They couldn't just pack one extra, they needed multiple replacements of every size. This canvas was heavy, bulky, and had to be kept meticulously dry to prevent rot and mildew. But it wasn't just for new sails. This material was also the bandage of the ship, used for patching existing sails that had been torn to ribbons by a storm, creating makeshift awnings to provide shelter from the sun or rain, and even serving as a primitive stretcher for wounded crew members. Every square foot had a potential purpose. To bind everything together, they carried miles of rope, officially known as cordage, in every conceivable thickness. There was thick anchor cable as wide as a man's wrist, and slender line for intricate rigging work. This rope was made from hemp or manila, and it was the circulatory system of the ship, controlling every sail and spar. Constant exposure to sun and salt water would weaken it, and chafing against wooden blocks could cause it to part with a sound like a gunshot. A broken line at a critical moment could send a heavy yard crashing down onto the deck, killing anyone underneath. The crew had to be able to splice and repair ropes constantly, and having a deep supply of raw material was non-negotiable. But wood and rope are useless without the adhesives to seal them. This is where the smell of the ship really came into play: tar and pitch. These thick, black, pungent substances, derived from pine trees, were the duct tape of the age of sail. Heated in a large pot, tar was brushed onto ropes to waterproof them and prevent rot. Pitch was used to caulk the seams between the hull planks, a process where strands of oakum, old, picked-apart rope fibers, were hammered into the gaps and then sealed over with the hot, sticky pitch, making the ship watertight. The holds carried enormous barrels of these substances, and the smell would permeate every corner of the vessel, a constant, greasy aroma that was the very scent of seaworthiness. The most advanced part of this floating workshop, however, was the blacksmith's forge. Yes, many larger exploration vessels actually carried a full, functioning forge and anvil. This wasn't for making new cannons, it was for the endless fabrication and repair of metal parts. The constant stress of sea travel meant that metal fittings, nails, bolts, hinges, bands, and rudder fittings would fatigue, rust, and break. The ship's blacksmith, working in a specially bricked-off section of the deck to contain the fire, could take bar iron from the hold and reforge a broken pintle that held the rudder, a task that literally meant the difference between steering and drifting. He could craft new nails to replace those that had rusted away in the hull, manufacture custom tools for the carpenter, or even repair weaponry. The forge itself was a dangerous necessity, a live fire on a wooden ship, but it represented the pinnacle of self-sufficiency, transforming the ship from a mere vehicle into a truly resilient, seagoing colony capable of rebuilding itself from the inside out. Yet amid this floating world of brutal practicality and communal survival, one space stood in stark contrast: the captain's cabin. Here, the ethos of mere survival gave way to the ambitions of discovery, diplomacy, and a determined grasp at comfort. While a common sailor's entire life was contained in a small, lockable chest, the captain's quarters were a universe unto themselves, often packed with items that served the dual purpose of maintaining morale and projecting authority. This was a calculated display, a piece of theater crucial for command. A captain dining alone on fine Chinese porcelain and drinking claret from a crystal glass wasn't just indulging. He was reinforcing the social hierarchy that kept a ship functional. It reminded the crew that he was not their peer, but their commander, a figure of civilization and order even in the most savage corners of the globe. This psychological divide was as important as any bulkhead in maintaining discipline on a voyage that could last for years. But these luxuries were more than just status symbols. They were vital tools for diplomacy. When inviting a powerful local leader aboard, the captain couldn't receive them in the grimy, cramped mess of the common sailors. He needed a space that conveyed respect, power, and refinement. Serving tea in a delicate cup or offering wine in a proper glass could set a tone of peaceful cultural exchange, turning a potential confrontation into a successful negotiation. A well-bound book from his personal library might be presented as a gift to a scholar or a ruler, a gesture that could secure invaluable aid or information. These items, which seemed like frivolous indulgences in the planning stages, often proved to be some of the most strategic cargo on the ship, smoothing the path for exploration where cannons alone would have failed. The true weight of the captain's privilege, however, was measured not in wine or china, but in the extraordinary responsibility of documentation. The captain was the chief scientist, the head cartographer, and the official chronicler of the voyage. His most precious cargo, therefore, was the suite of specialized instruments that would transform raw experience into lasting knowledge. The most iconic of these was the telescope. More than just a tool for spotting land, a high-quality refracting telescope was essential for surveying coastlines from a safe distance, examining the details of a foreign port, or studying celestial bodies to aid in navigation. It extended the captain's vision far beyond the horizon, making the unknown just a little more knowable. This delicate instrument, with its polished brass tubes and ground glass lenses, was kept in a velvet lined case, protected from the corrosive salt air that could fog its optics and render it useless. Alongside the telescope were the tools of the naturalist. A voyage of discovery was expected to bring back more than just stories. It was expected to expand the entire world's understanding of natural history. To that end, captains packed empty specimen jars of glass and ceramic, along with powders and alcohols for preserving the bizarre and beautiful new life forms they encountered. A strange fish, a colorful bird, an unusual spider, or a never-before-seen plant would be carefully preserved and cataloged. These weren't mere souvenirs, they were scientific gold, physical proof of their discoveries that would be presented to royal societies and museums back in Europe, rewriting textbooks and astounding the academic world. But perhaps the most important tools of all were those for creating the map itself: paper, ink, and drafting instruments. Paper was a precious commodity, vulnerable to dampness and mildew. It was stored in sealed chests, often with packets of lavender or other herbs to ward off insects. The captain or his designated artist would use fine, waterproof inks and a selection of carefully sharpened quills or pencils to meticulously draw what they saw. Every bay, every headland, every river mouth was painstakingly recorded on paper, transforming a vague coastline into a defined navigable chart. They used compasses and rules not for navigation, but for drafting, transferring the angles and distances measured with their sextants onto paper with mathematical precision. Every evening in the captain's cabin, by the flickering light of an oil lamp, the blank spaces on the world map were slowly filled in. This was the ultimate purpose of the voyage, and it was these quiet hours of documentation, surrounded by the tools of science and reason, that truly shrank the world and built the foundations of our modern understanding of the planet. This meticulous planning extended far beyond a simple list of supplies, transforming into a complex, three-dimensional puzzle where the placement of every single barrel, crate, and cannonball was a calculated decision with life or death consequences. Loading an exploration vessel was not a haphazard process of filling empty space. It was a carefully orchestrated ballet of weight and balance, a final test of foresight before the ship ever left the safety of the harbor. The goal was to create a stable, seaworthy platform that could withstand the immense and unpredictable forces of the open ocean, and it all came down to the science of stowage. The single most important principle governing this entire operation was the placement of weight. To prevent the ship from becoming an unstable, top-heavy death trap prone to capsizing in a strong gust of wind, the heaviest items had to be stored as low in the hull as possible. This meant the massive iron cannons were secured on the lowest deck, their tremendous weight acting as a counterbalance deep in the belly of the ship, helping it right itself after being heeled over by a powerful wave. Directly alongside these guns went the ship's true ballast, thousands of pounds of stone or shingle. This dead weight was unglamorous but essential, pure mass positioned at the very bottom of the hold solely to lower the ship's center of gravity and provide that crucial inherent stability. Just above this, in the dank, dark depths near the keel, were the enormous water casks and barrels of salt meat. Water is incredibly heavy, and storing these vital but burdensome reserves low down helped maintain equilibrium without sacrificing valuable space. As the loaders moved upward through the ship, the cargo gradually became lighter. The middle decks would hold the bulky but less dense supplies, sacks of flour and grain, bundles of spare canvas for sails, and the countless wooden crates containing trade goods like cloth and beads. The highest storage areas, often in the 'tween decks or near the forecastle, were reserved for the lightest items of all. This included the crew's personal sea chests, coils of spare rope, and perhaps bundles of dried tobacco or empty barrels waiting to be filled with fresh water at the next landfall. This graduated system of weight distribution was the unsung hero of naval architecture, a silent guardian against the ocean's relentless attempts to roll the vessel over. But stability was only half the battle. The other monumental challenge was sheer volume. Every single cubic inch of the hold was precious real estate, and wasting space was a luxury no captain could afford. This led to a practice known as breaking bulk, where large shipments were removed from their original packaging and repacked to fit the irregular, curved contours of the ship's interior. A shipment of thousands of nails, for instance, wouldn't be left in loose, awkward crates. Instead, the nails would be poured directly into empty spaces between the larger, fixed items like water casks, filling every possible void like a liquid. Sacks of grain and flour were meticulously stacked and wedged into place, forming a solid mass that shifted less in rough seas. The ship's carpenter and cooper were central figures in this process, constantly crafting custom shelves, partitions, and racks to secure this chaotic inventory and prevent a phenomenon known as cargo shift. Cargo shift was the loader's nightmare. In a storm, if the carefully stowed supplies broke free from their constraints, the results could be catastrophic. A loose cannon rolling across a gun deck was the most dramatic example, but even a sudden slide of heavy barrels to one side of the hold could create a dangerous, permanent list. A ship leaning too far to one side would sail inefficiently, its sails unable to catch the wind properly, and in an extreme case, it could take on water through its gun ports and sink. To prevent this, the hold was a web of ropes, chains, and wooden stanchions. Barrels were lashed down tight. Crates were nailed shut and wedged together. Nothing was left to chance. The final act of this loading ballet was often the placement of the live animals, goats, pigs, and chickens, in their makeshift pens on the deck, adding one last layer of chaotic life to the now meticulously ordered floating city, ready to cast off its lines and sail into the pages of history. Yet for all the tons of salted meat, the miles of spare rope, and the gleaming brass instruments, the single most vital asset any explorer carried was not something that could be stowed in a barrel or locked in a chest. It was the collective knowledge and skill of the men themselves. A ship could be perfectly provisioned, but without the right hands and minds to wield those provisions, it was just a floating warehouse doomed to failure. The true intangible cargo was human expertise, a diverse and specialized workforce crammed into that wooden world, each man a walking, breathing toolkit essential for the voyage survival. At the heart of this human machinery was the carpenter. His value was immeasurable. The ship was under constant assault from the sea, from the boring of shipworms to the battering of waves. A sprung plank, a cracked deck beam, or a shattered rudder meant imminent disaster. The carpenter's domain was his chest of tools, saws, adzes, hammers, and augers, but his real worth was in his ability to use them under desperate conditions. He had to be able to fashion a new spar from a raw log while the ship rolled violently, or perform an emergency patch on the hull from a rocking boat alongside the ship, with the ocean pouring in. His work didn't just keep the vessel afloat, it maintained the very integrity of their entire world. Working in close concert with him was the cooper, the barrel maker. In an age before plastic and metal containers, the cooper was the master of storage. Every essential liquid water, beer, wine, rum, and even many dry goods like flour or nails was held in barrels he crafted and maintained. A poorly made cask could mean the loss of 100 gallons of fresh water, a catastrophe that could doom the voyage, but his skill went beyond simple construction. The cooper was constantly inspecting his barrels, tightening hoops, and resealing staves swollen or shrunk by changes in humidity and temperature. He knew how to diagnose a leak by its sound and smell, and his ability to keep their precious supplies secure was quite literally a matter of life and death for everyone on board. Then there was the sailmaker, the textile surgeon of the ship. Canvas sails were the engine, and they were perpetually being tested to their limits. A sudden squall could tear a main topsail to ribbons in minutes. The sailmaker's kit, filled with massive needles, palms, and rolls of spare cloth, was his operating theater. His job was one of relentless maintenance and emergency repair, often working in howling wind and lashing rain to stitch a torn sail back together, his hands moving with a muscle memory born of experience. He didn't just fix tiers, he understood how to reinforce weak points, how to cut new sails from raw bolt cloth, and how to manage the ship's most important and most vulnerable physical asset. And when the bodies of the crew inevitably broke down from accident, combat, or illness, the ship's surgeon stepped in, often a figure of dread as much as hope. His knowledge was a bizarre mix of archaic theory and brutal, practical experience. He might believe in the four humors and the need for bloodletting, but he also knew how to set a compound fracture, extract a musket ball, or perform a lightning-fast amputation with a Catlin knife and saw. His tools were horrifying, but his steady hand and his knowledge of anatomy, however limited, were the only things standing between an injured sailor and a painful death from infection. He was part doctor, part butcher, and his presence, however frightening, offered a sliver of hope in a world without hospitals. Beyond these specialists were the sailors themselves, each a master of 100 small, critical tasks. There were men who could read the subtle patterns of the wind on the water to predict a coming storm. Others were experts in tying a specific knot that would hold under immense strain, but could be released in an instant. The cook, working his magic in a tiny, swaying galley with limited provisions, had to know how to transform weevil-infested hardtack and salt pork into something vaguely palatable, using little more than a large pot and a carefully managed fire. This vast repository of practical knowledge, passed down through generations of seafarers, was the ultimate, unbreakable tool. It was knowledge that couldn't be rusted, rotted, or depleted. It was the one cargo that grew more valuable with each passing mile into the unknown, the invisible inventory that truly allowed humanity to conquer the sea. To truly grasp the monumental achievement of these provisioning systems, we should turn our focus to a single legendary expedition, Christopher Columbus's first voyage across the Atlantic in 1492. The planning for this journey reveals the stark realities of exploration logistics, merging hope, myth, and gritty practicality. The royal contract from King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain didn't just grant Columbus titles, it provided a detailed budget for supplies, a shopping list for an attempted leap into the void. The three ships under his command, the larger Santa Maria and the smaller caravels Nina and Pinta, were floating testaments to the era's best guesses. We know from surviving royal account books and ships' registers exactly what was purchased in the months before they sailed from Palos de España, a catalog of necessity that reads like a snapshot of 15th century life. The foundation of their diet was, as always, preserved protein. The holds were packed with salt pork and salt cod, the latter being a staple from the nearby fisheries. This wasn't just a few barrels. We're talking about quantities meant to feed around 90 men for an indeterminate period, likely amounting to tens of thousands of pounds of cured meat and fish. Alongside this, the most crucial carbohydrate was hardtack, known then as ship's biscuit. Historical records indicate they loaded enough of this durable bread to last for many, many months. The baking and procurement of this biscuit would have been a major operation in itself, requiring vast quantities of flour and a small army of bakers working for weeks to produce the rock-hard loaves that would not spoil. For liquid sustenance, the records show a substantial investment in wine and water. They carried more wine than fresh water, a sensible choice given that wine kept far better in casks. The water, stored in large wooden barrels, was always a gamble, likely to turn foul and green within weeks. The wine provided not only hydration but calories and a small morale boost, a tiny piece of Spanish normalcy they could cling to each day. Alongside these staples were other dry goods: cheese, dried peas and beans, olive oil and vinegar, which was often used to make stale water more palatable by creating a primitive drinking water additive known as agua de horchata. But Columbus wasn't just packing for survival, he was packing for success as he imagined it. His instructions were to reach the Indies and establish contact with the Great Khan, the ruler of lands described by Marco Polo. To that end, a significant portion of his cargo was dedicated not to food, but to trade and display. The historical manifests list items like glass beads in multiple colors, brass hawk bells, and other cheap but shiny trinkets. To modern eyes, these seem like worthless baubles, but to Columbus and his backers, they were the currency of empire. They were chosen based on reports from earlier Portuguese voyages down the African coast, where such items had been found to be of high value to local populations. He also carried more practical trade goods like woolen cloth, sugar, and black pepper, anticipating a commercial exchange. Perhaps most revealing of their expectations are the items packed for showcasing European power and forging diplomatic ties. Columbus's personal baggage included fine clothing and a sword, so he could present himself as a worthy emissary. The ships carried samples of weaponry and armor, not just for defense, but as potential gifts to impress local rulers. They even brought a licensed notary public, whose job would be to officially witness and document any claims of discovery or treaties made with foreign leaders. This highlights that the voyage was as much a mission of diplomacy and annexation as it was one of exploration. Every single item, from the lowest barrel of salt pork to the most colorful glass bead, was a calculated piece of a grand plan, a bet placed on a map that was mostly blank. The provisioning of the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria was a perfect, pressurized microcosm of the entire age of discovery, a blend of meticulous preparation, wild ambition, and a profound, world-altering leap into the complete unknown. If the logistics of Columbus's voyage were a leap of faith, the outfitting of His Majesty's bark Endeavour just over 275 years later represented a quantum leap in rational, scientific planning. Captain James Cook's famous first voyage from 1768 to 1771 was a mission of a completely different order, blending imperial ambition with the relentless curiosity of the Enlightenment. This wasn't just about finding new lands, it was about measuring the universe, cataloging creation, and applying the sharp blade of reason to one of exploration's oldest and deadliest problems: scurvy. The Endeavour's hold was a testament to this new age, packed not just with salt pork and hardtack, but with hypotheses, experiments, and a meticulously curated library of scientific instruments. The most revolutionary aspect of Cook's provisioning was his fanatical, almost obsessive, crusade against the scourge of scurvy. By the mid-18th century, the connection between fresh provisions and the disease was becoming clearer, though the exact mechanism of vitamin C was still a century away from discovery. Cook, a meticulous and pragmatic commander, became a fervent evangelist for a multi-pronged, experimental approach. The most famous item he championed was sauerkraut. This fermented cabbage was not a new invention, but its use as a primary anti-scorbutic on a naval voyage was groundbreaking. Cook didn't just carry it, he marketed it to his crew with brilliant psychological insight. He initially had it served only at the officer's table, creating an aura of a coveted luxury. Soon enough, the regular sailors were demanding their share, and Cook was happy to oblige, ensuring the entire crew regularly consumed the tangy, nutrient-rich preserve. But his experimentation didn't stop there. The Admiralty, deeply invested in the voyage's success, supplied him with a variety of other potential cures based on the scientific theories of the day. He carried malt wort, a concoction derived from brewing, which was believed to have anti-putrid properties. He had a thick, syrupy reduction of citrus juice called rob, though the process of boiling it, which destroyed much of the vitamin C, sadly rendered it largely ineffective. He also insisted on seizing every possible opportunity to gather fresh food. Whenever the Endeavour made landfall, Cook detailed parties to harvest wild celery, scurvy grass, and other greens, and he traded with local communities for fresh fish and meat. His holistic strategy, combining preserved preventatives with a relentless pursuit of fresh provisions, was stunningly successful. On a voyage that lasted nearly 3 years, he did not lose a single man to scurvy, an achievement so extraordinary it made him a legend in naval circles and radically changed how all future long-distance voyages were provisioned. Beyond this medical revolution, the Endeavour's primary mission was one of pure science: to travel to Tahiti and observe the transit of Venus across the Sun. This rare celestial event, when properly measured from different points on the globe, would allow astronomers to calculate the distance between the Earth and the Sun, finally providing a fundamental astronomical unit of measurement. To accomplish this, the ship was transformed into a floating observatory, carrying an array of instruments of breathtaking precision and fragility. The most important of these were the astronomical quadrants. These large brass instruments, finely engraved with degrees and minutes, were used to measure the precise altitude of celestial bodies. Protecting these delicate devices from the corrosive salt air and the violent motion of the ship was a paramount concern. They were kept in heavy, custom-built wooden cases, packed in soft padding, and only assembled under a temporary observatory tent on the stable ground of Tahiti. The expedition also carried several reflecting telescopes, the cutting-edge technology of the day, which used mirrors to gather light and provide a brighter, clearer image of the stars and planets than older refracting models. To ensure perfect timing, absolutely critical for the transit observations, they brought multiple marine timekeepers, including a regulator clock made by the renowned John Shelton. This was not a sea-going chronometer like Harrison's, but a precision pendulum clock intended for use on land. Its safe transport across thousands of miles of ocean, only to be set up and perfectly calibrated on a tropical island, speaks volumes about the meticulous care given to this scientific cargo. The success of the Tahiti observations was a triumph of logistics and precision, a moment where a wooden sailing ship on the far side of the world successfully contributed to humanity's understanding of the cosmos. And then there were the tools of discovery for discovery's sake. The Endeavour carried something entirely new for a naval vessel: a full-fledged scientific team. Aboard were the wealthy naturalist Joseph Banks, the Swedish botanist Daniel Solander, the landscape artist Alexander Butchen, and the natural history artist Sidney Parkinson. Their presence demanded a completely different class of supplies. The hold was packed not with extra cannonballs, but with empty specimen jars, glass bottles, and volumes of blank paper for pressing plants. They brought vast quantities of artist supplies: pencils, inks, watercolors, and stacks of paper for capturing the flora, fauna, and people they would encounter in breathtaking detail. For preserving their finds, they carried barrels of high-proof alcohol for pickling animal specimens, from strange fish to exotic insects. They had boxes of shot and powder for collecting bird specimens, and piles of coarse cloth and cotton wool for carefully wrapping delicate seeds, leaves, and flowers. Every time the ship anchored, this team would spill onto the shore, not to claim land for the crown, but to claim knowledge for science. They collected, described, and drew thousands of species entirely new to European science, from the iconic kangaroo of Australia to the intricate ecosystems of the Great Barrier Reef. The packing lists for this endeavor read less like a naval manifest and more like the inventory of a moving museum and a traveling artist's studio. The Endeavor's voyage marked a fundamental shift. It was no longer enough to simply return with a claim on a map. The new imperative was to return with a deeper understanding of the world itself, packed carefully in a jar of alcohol or pressed between the pages of a book. Yet while the Endeavour represented the pinnacle of maritime preparation, a radically different kind of exploration was taking shape on the other side of the world, one where the ocean was replaced by an ocean of grass and the ship was replaced by pack horses. Just a few decades later, President Thomas Jefferson would dispatch Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on an overland expedition to find a practical route to the Pacific. This journey required a complete rethinking of the explorers' packing list. trading the deep holds of a ship for the limited cargo space of a keelboat and, later, the backs of weary animals. Their mission wasn't just to traverse the continent, but to document it thoroughly, and every axe, rifle, and piece metal was chosen with that immense task in mind. The expedition began its journey propelled by the muscle of a 55-foot keelboat, a shallow draft vessel designed to navigate the powerful currents of the Missouri River. This floating warehouse was packed to the gunwales with over 12 tons of supplies, a carefully curated arsenal for survival, science, and diplomacy. Unlike a sea-going vessel that had to be entirely self-sufficient, the core of Discovery's strategy was built around planned resupply through hunting and forging relationships with Native American tribes. This shifted the focus from sheer quantity of preserved food to the tools needed to procure fresh provisions along the way. The most vital of these were their firearms. They carried a small arsenal of 54 caliber Kentucky long rifles, prized for their accuracy and power, along with dozens of pounds of black powder and lead for casting bullets. These weren't just for defense, they were the expedition's primary grocery store, essential for bringing down the buffalo, elk, and deer that would feed the Corps for weeks at a time. Beyond hunting, their ability to be self-reliant in the wilderness hinged on another set of crucial tools, the blacksmithing kit. A portable forge, anvils, hammers, and tongs were among the heaviest items they carried, but their value was incalculable. The blacksmiths in the group could repair weapons, shoe horses, and, most importantly, create custom goods for trade. This transformed the expedition from a mere group of travelers into a mobile factory. They could fashion arrowheads, axes, and metal points into valuable trade items, often more desired than the standard beads and cloth they brought from the East. This ability to manufacture goodwill on the spot became a key to their survival, allowing them to barter for the horses absolutely essential for crossing the rugged Rocky Mountains. The diplomatic cargo itself was a fascinating reflection of Jefferson's ambitions. There were the expected trade goods, over 2,000 sewing needles, hundreds of yards of brightly colored ribbon, lace handkerchiefs, and 20 pounds of assorted glass beads. But the most powerful items were the piece metals. These specially struck silver medals featured a profile of President Jefferson on one side, and symbols of peace and commerce, clasped hands, and a crossed pipe and hatchet on the other. They were presented to important chiefs during carefully orchestrated ceremonies. These weren't mere trinkets, they were physical symbols of a proposed new relationship with the United States, intended to secure safe passage and gather intelligence. Alongside the medals, they carried bundles of scarlet blue and military coats, meant as prestigious gifts to honor tribal leaders and demonstrate the power and generosity of the American government. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the expedition, however, was its commitment to documentation. Lewis and Clark were charged with mapping the territory and recording every detail of the flora, fauna, and people they encountered. To this end, they packed a traveling library of scientific instruments similar to those on the Endeavour, including sextants and chronometers for determining latitude and longitude. But their most frequently used tools were far simpler: bundles of quills, cakes of ink powder, and vast reams of writing paper, all carefully waterproofed in tin boxes. These materials fueled the obsession with journaling that defined the journey. Every member of the Corps was encouraged to write, resulting in over 1 million words of descriptive text that meticulously captured the breathtaking scope of the American West, from the towering grizzly bear to the delicate bitterroot flower, creating a written record as vital as any map and ensuring their journey would inform generations long after their last pack horse was unloaded. Despite the mountains of salted provisions and carefully calculated rations, the most crucial line on any explorer's packing list was often an invisible one: the plan to find more. No ship, no matter how perfectly stocked, could carry enough to last for years. The real secret to survival wasn't just what they brought with them, but their utter reliance on their ability to resupply from the environment around them. This wasn't a backup plan. It was a central pillar of the entire voyage logistics, a high-stakes gamble that the blank spaces on their maps would be filled with fresh water, edible plants, and cooperative wildlife. Every expedition was, in essence, a race against its own consumption, desperately needing to reach the next source of provisions before the holds ran empty. This strategy of foraging took many forms, each with its own risks and rewards. Hunting was perhaps the most sought-after method for replenishment. A single large animal, like a seal on a remote Arctic island or a buffalo on the plains of the New World, could provide a massive infusion of fresh meat, revitalizing a crew weakened by months of salted rations. The ships carried specialized gear for this very purpose: muskets with different caliber shot for various game, fishing lines and nets with hooks of every size, and even harpoons for the larger prey they might encounter in the sea. A successful hunt was a moment of pure celebration, a temporary reprieve from the grim specter of malnutrition, and a vital source of the nutrients that prevented diseases like scurvy. Fishing offered a more consistent, if less dramatic, opportunity. Lines were trailed behind the ship whenever they were sailing slowly, a constant hope for a fresh meal. In coastal waters or when anchored in a bay, crews would lower small boats to cast nets, sometimes hauling in a dizzying abundance of seafood that could feed everyone for days. This was considered a far safer and more reliable method than hunting on unknown shores, as it didn't risk dangerous encounters or require the crew to venture far from the ship. A bountiful catch could instantly lift morale and restore the health of men who had been living on depleted stores. The most fundamental prize of all, however, was fresh water. Despite the enormous casks stored in the hold, water was the first and most critical resource to run low or spoil. The sight of a waterfall cascading down a cliffside or a clear river emptying into a bay was enough to bring a ship to a full stop. Teams would row ashore with every available empty barrel, filling them to the brim and celebrating this most basic of victories. Finding a clean source wasn't just about quenching thirst, it was about resetting the clock, allowing them to mix their remaining alcohol with fresh water instead of foul, and giving everyone a chance to wash the grime of weeks at sea from their bodies and clothes. But this entire system was built on a foundation of hope rather than certainty. Explorers were sailing off the edge of their known world, guided by charts that were often more myth than geography. They couldn't possibly predict the ecosystems they would find. A coastline that looked lush and green on a map might offer nothing but brackish water and poisonous berries. A promised paradise island might be a barren rock devoid of any game. The weather itself could thwart them. A prolonged period of calm seas, known as the doldrums, meant no progress toward new foraging grounds and no wind to power the ship, leaving them to slowly consume their remaining supplies under a punishing sun. A sudden storm could force them to bypass a potential landing site, missing a critical chance to resupply. When the gamble failed, the consequences were swift and horrifying. The history of exploration is littered with tragedies born of failed foraging. Ships would find themselves trapped in ice for months, their hunting parties returning empty-handed as wildlife migrated away. Expeditions penetrating deserts or arid coastlines would die of thirst within sight of their goal, the promised rivers on their maps having long since dried up. The most famous tales of starvation, from the Franklin expedition in the Arctic to the Donner Party on land, are ultimate testaments to THIS Chinese letter strategy. They packed for what they expected to find, and when the environment refused to provide, their carefully laid plans became their death warrants. This constant dance with the unknown, this faith that the next landfall would hold salvation, was the silent, terrifying companion to every great journey of discovery. A reminder that for all their planning, explorers were always just one empty horizon away from disaster. Yet for all the triumphs of careful planning, the annals of exploration are also filled with chilling stories of expeditions that vanished or met with disaster, often because of a single, critical flaw in their provisioning. These failures serve as stark counterpoints to the successes of Cook and Lewis and Clark. Grim reminders that no amount of courage could compensate for a rotten can or a missed deadline. We often think of these tragedies as being caused by the raw power of nature, a terrible storm or an impassable mountain range, but so often, the true culprit was a much quieter, more insidious error in the logic of packing itself. Consider the fate of Sir John Franklin's final Arctic expedition, which set sail from England in 1845 with 2 stout ships, the Erebus and Terror, and 129 men. On paper, they were the most technologically advanced exploration vessels ever to venture into the Northwest Passage. They were powered by steam engines, heated by sophisticated hot water systems, and carried a 3-year supply of the very latest in food preservation technology, canned goods. This was not the old salted meat and hardtack of previous generations. This was modern science, offering a seemingly limitless supply of nutritious, palatable food sealed away from the elements in sturdy tins. The expedition was a sensation, a symbol of Victorian-era confidence in its own industrial prowess, and then it simply disappeared. For years, the fate of the Franklin expedition was one of the world's great mysteries. The clues, when they were finally pieced together by search parties and later by modern archaeologists, pointed to a catastrophic failure rooted in their very provisions. The cans that were meant to save them may have instead poisoned them. In the 1840s, the process of canning involved sealing cooked food in a tin-plated can and soldering the lid shut with a lead-based alloy. It's now believed that this solder, in contact with the acidic food inside, leached dangerous levels of lead into the expedition supplies. Crew members would have been slowly and unknowingly poisoned, suffering from lead-induced fatigue, weakness, and mental confusion, symptoms that would have made the already brutal conditions of an Arctic winter utterly unsurvivable. They were weakened, perhaps even driven mad, by the very technology they trusted to keep them strong. When the ships became hopelessly trapped in the ice, their crews, already debilitated, had to attempt a desperate trek across the barren tundra. The evidence suggests they resorted to cannibalism before ultimately succumbing, a horrifying end for men who had set out with the finest provisions the modern world could offer. Their story is a profound lesson in the law of unintended consequences, where a seemingly perfect solution contained the seed of its own destruction. On land, a different kind of packing miscalculation was unfolding with equally tragic results. The story of the Donner Party in 1846 is often remembered for its gruesome ending, but its beginning was a story of ambitious overpacking and disastrously poor planning. This was not a naval expedition, but a wagon train of families heading west to California, and their cargo was a life on the move. They overloaded their wagons with heavy furniture, heirlooms, and vast quantities of supplies they believed would establish their new lives, items that reflected their dreams but drastically slowed their progress. They were confident, perhaps arrogant, in their initial preparations, but they failed to pack the one thing they would need most: time. Their critical error was choosing a new and untested route called the Hastings Cutoff, which promised to shorten their journey, but instead delivered them into a nightmare of rugged terrain and impossible delays. The route was far more difficult than advertised, forcing them to hack a road through thick forests and haul their overburdened wagons across salt flats and steep mountains. The brutal labor exhausted their oxen and consumed their supplies at an alarming rate. Weeks turned into months, and the early autumn snows that would have been a minor inconvenience to a group on schedule became a death sentence for the stranded Donner Party. Trapped in the high Sierra Nevada, their carefully packed food stores, the barrels of flour, the sacks of beans, the salted meat were quickly depleted. They had packed for a journey, not a siege by winter. Their situation became so desperate that they boiled and ate their ox-hide ropes and rug strips, trying to extract any last bit of nutrition from the collagen before turning to the unthinkable. The Donner Party's tragedy wasn't caused by a technological failure like lead poisoning, but by a fatal misjudgment of geography and pace. They packed their wagons for the journey they wanted to have, not for the journey the wilderness actually demanded. And when the environment refused to cooperate, their abundant supplies proved woefully inadequate. This relentless cycle of trial and error, written in the ledger books of success and the stark inventories of failure, slowly forged a new science of expedition planning. The journey from the wooden casks of Columbus to the insulated tins of Scott was not a straight line but a sprawling, messy evolution. driven as much by tragedy as by triumph. The old ways, born of Mediterranean and Atlantic seafaring, were brutally tested by the vastness of the Pacific and the crushing silence of the polar ice. Each new environment demanded its own unique toolkit, forcing explorers to adapt, innovate, and sometimes completely reinvent what it meant to be prepared. The Age of Discovery, for all its daring, operated on a model of sheer volume and tradition. The provisioning lists for Magellan or Drake would have looked remarkably similar to those of Columbus a century earlier. An overwhelming reliance on salted proteins, hard carbohydrates, and alcoholic liquids. The core philosophy was to overwhelm the unknown with a massive surplus of the known. They packed for time, not for terrain, assuming that the challenges of the Pacific would be similar to those of the Atlantic, just longer. This approach saw them through, but often just barely, with crews ravaged by scurvy and surviving on the very edge of starvation. Innovation was slow and often resisted. It took decades for the proven anti-scorbutic properties of citrus to become standard issue, bogged down by institutional inertia and a lack of understanding about why it worked. The great pivot began in the late 18th century with the scientific voyages of Cook and La Pérouse. This was the Enlightenment applied to the ship's hold. The goal was no longer just to survive the journey, but to thrive long enough to conduct precise astronomy, cartography, and naturalism. This required a healthier, more alert crew, which in turn demanded a more nuanced approach to food. Cook's famous experiments with sauerkraut, malt wort, and concentrated lemon juice were a systematic, almost clinical, attempt to solve the scurvy problem through observation and data. The ship itself became a laboratory, and every barrel of pickled cabbage was part of a larger hypothesis. This era introduced the idea of the expedition as a scientific instrument, where the quality and specificity of provisions were directly tied to the mission's success. It was no longer enough to have food. The food had to perform a function beyond mere caloric intake. This scientific approach reached its apex in the 19th century's race to the poles. Here, the environment was not just an obstacle, it was an active, hostile adversary. The Arctic and Antarctic demanded a complete overhaul of the explorer's kit. The classic seafaring diet of salt meat and hardtack was worse than useless in extreme cold. It provided calories but lacked the crucial vitamins and fats needed to stoke the human furnace against relentless sub-zero temperatures. Pioneers like Fridtjof Nansen understood this intuitively. For his daring attempt to reach the North Pole by drifting in the ice-locked Fram, he prioritized energy density above all else. His men consumed pounds of butter, pemmican, a concentrated paste of dried meat and fat borrowed from North American indigenous cultures, and even deliberately ingested whale blubber. Every ounce of weight had to deliver maximum caloric payoff. The packing strategies for the poles also revolutionized equipment. The heavy, cumbersome woolens of the sailing ship were supplemented by layers of lightweight yet insulating materials like silk and fur. Breathable windproof fabrics were developed to ward off the lethal chill of windburn. Footwear evolved from leather boots to customized mucklucks and felt-lined finnesko, designed to prevent frostbite during long sledging runs. This was equipment designed for a specific, brutal purpose, a far cry from the multipurpose, make-do gear of earlier centuries. Perhaps the greatest contrast can be seen in the famed rivalry between Robert Falcon Scott and Ernest Shackleton in Antarctica. Scott's Terra Nova expedition, while courageous, clung to certain 19th century traditions that proved fatal. His reliance on ponies instead of dogs for primary haulage was a miscalculation, as the horses struggled in the deep snow and required bulky fodder that took up critical cargo space. His team's man hauled their heavy sledges, an exhausting practice that burned precious calories far faster than they could be replaced. While Scott utilized some modern provisions like pemmican, the overall strategy was one of brute force over optimized efficiency. Shackleton, learning from the tragedy of his former commander, embraced a more holistic and flexible approach for his endurance expedition. His packing list was a masterpiece of contingency planning. While his ship was famously crushed by the ice, The supplies salvaged from it were precisely what allowed his crew to survive for months on the floes and eventually make their incredible open boat journey to South Georgia. He packed not for the journey he hoped to have, but for the disaster he feared. This included a wealth of specialized equipment, sledging rations with a perfect fat-to-protein ratio, reinforced lifeboats, and the social foresight to pack books, games, and musical instruments, understanding that morale was a tangible resource that needed provisioning just like food. Shackleton's success in bringing all his men back alive from such an ordeal stands as the ultimate testament to how far the science of expedition packing had come. From simply loading a ship to preparing for every conceivable twist of fate in the world's most unforgiving environment. While the packing lists and captain's logs give us the theory, the cold, silent evidence resting on the seabed provides the undeniable truth. Underwater archaeology has pulled these historical mysteries from the realm of documents and into stunning, tangible reality. The preserved remains of great ships like the Mary Rose and the Vasa act as miraculous time capsules, their hulls containing a frozen moment of daily life, allowing us to reach across centuries and touch the very items explorers packed, used, and cherished. The recovery of Henry VIII's warship, the Mary Rose, after she sank in 1545, offered an unprecedented glimpse into Tudor-era naval life. The silt of the Solent provided an oxygen-free environment that perfectly preserved a breathtaking array of organic materials that would have normally rotted away centuries ago. Among the thousands of artifacts raised were over 120 pairs of leather shoes, each one telling a story. We don't just know that sailors had footwear, we can see the individual wear patterns on the soles, the careful repairs made by their owners, and the distinct styles that range from practical ankle boots to more decorative slip-ons for off-duty wear. Even more intimate were the personal possessions found in the chests of the barber surgeon. His cabin yielded a complete set of expertly crafted brass syringes for treating venereal diseases, meticulously stored in a wooden box alongside his razors and bowls. We can see the very medications he packed, pots of ointment still sealed with their original animal skin covers, and a delicate peppercorn, perhaps his own private stash to spice up the monotonous ship's diet. These aren't just artifacts, they are the physical proof of the individual humanity aboard a floating fortress, the small comforts and professional tools each man chose to bring into danger. Similarly, the Swedish warship Vasa, which infamously capsized and sank on her maiden voyage in 1628, provides a perfectly preserved snapshot of early 17th century naval preparation. The cold, brackish waters of Stockholm Harbor kept her contents in a remarkable state. Stepping into the lower decks of the Vasa Museum is like walking onto a ship that was just unloaded yesterday. There are the actual wooden casks, still stacked exactly as they were stowed, containing the beef and pork that was to feed the crew. We can see the giant wooden plates from which the sailors would have eaten, and the tiny wooden spoons they carried personally. The ship's carpenters left behind their tool chests, filled with saws, planes, and augers, ready to make repairs that would never be needed. Perhaps most hauntingly, archaeologists found the skeletons of crew members alongside their final possessions, a set of dice for gambling, a small knife, a tin of buttons. These finds move us beyond the grand strategy of exploration and into the gritty reality of it, confirming that every voyage, no matter how well planned, was ultimately a collection of individuals who packed their hopes, their vices, and their tools, all together in a wooden shell. Beyond these famous wrecks, countless other discoveries fill in the details of the explorer's inventory. The wreck of the Batavia, a Dutch East India Company ship lost in 1629 off the coast of Australia, revealed the stark contrast between the lavish provisions of the command staff and the basic rations of the common sailor. Excavations uncovered elegant silverware and fine porcelain for the officers, stored alongside the standard issue of hardtack and salted fish. From much older Roman wrecks in the Mediterranean, we have recovered entire amphorae, the ancient world's shipping containers, still bearing the faded painted labels identifying their contents of wine, olive oil, or garum fish sauce. Each carefully excavated amphora is a data point in a 2,000-year-old supply chain. These underwater finds do more than just confirm historical records. They constantly challenge and refine them, showing us the differences between what was officially mandated and what was actually done, between what was planned for and what was truly needed when the unimaginable happened and the sea claimed its due. Hollywood would have us believe the age of exploration was a glittering parade of galleons overflowing with Spanish doubloons, where dashing captains sipped wine in spacious, oak-paneled cabins. The reality, as we've discovered, was a world away from this romantic fiction. The driving force behind these voyages was rarely a simple lust for gold. It was a complex mix of national ambition, scientific curiosity, and the pursuit of strategic advantage. While wealth was certainly a motivator for backers and crew alike, the primary treasure most explorers sought was knowledge-accurate maps, new trade routes, and scientific specimens. The contents of their ships reflected this: not chests of jewels, but crates of scientific instruments, barrels of sauerkraut, and bundles of cheap trade goods. The notion of lavish living quarters is perhaps the most easily debunked myth. A captain's cabin, while private and better appointed than the common areas, was still a cramped, damp, and constantly moving space. For the vast majority of the crew, the concept of personal space was non-existent. They slept wherever they could find room, often on the deck itself or in hammocks slung so close together that men were constantly jostled by their neighbors. There was no ventilation to speak of, and the air below decks was a thick, suffocating cocktail of smells. The greasy odor of tar, the pungent reek of unwashed bodies, the sour tang of bilge water, and the ever-present funk of mildew creeping into every piece of cloth and leather. This was a world of relentless dampness and cold. Seasickness was a constant for newcomers, and the ship's rolling motion never truly ceased. Clothing, once wet, rarely dried completely, leading to a perpetual chill and skin conditions like immersion foot. The diet, as we've covered, was a monotonous assault of salt and hardness, a far cry from the feasts depicted on screen. There were no grand dining halls. Men ate where they worked, often using their own knives to spear pieces of salt pork off a shared platter. The romance of the sea, in day-to-day life, was entirely absent, replaced by the grinding reality of wet wool, weevil-infested biscuit, and the back-breaking labor of pumping water from the hold or wrestling with frozen sails in a gale. The true purpose of packing, then, becomes crystal clear when we strip away the Hollywood glamour. Every decision was made through the brutal lens of survival and mission success. Comfort was not a factor. There was no room for non-essential luxuries. That carefully calculated space for an extra barrel of sauerkraut directly meant there was no space for a larger, more comfortable bed for the captain. The weight allotted to spare cordage and timber was weight that could not be used for personal chests full of fine clothes. This ruthless prioritization is the authentic story of exploration logistics. It wasn't about what would make the journey pleasant, it was about what would make it possible. The real treasure wasn't found in a pirate's chest, it was found in a successful landfall, a friendly trade interaction, an accurately drawn chart, and most importantly, in the simple, profound achievement of bringing every single member of the crew back home alive. Yet beyond the barrels of sauerkraut and the chests of navigational tools, the most volatile and unpredictable element any captain had to manage was not the wind or the waves, but the human spirit. You can pack all the food and water needed to sustain the body, but if you fail to nourish the mind, the entire voyage risks collapsing into despair and rebellion. For journeys spanning years, the psychological toll of isolation, monotony, and constant danger was a threat as real as any storm, and astute commanders understood that their packing lists needed to include a very different kind of sustenance: instruments of joy, distraction, and temporary escape. The most potent weapon against the soul-crushing grind of daily life at sea was unquestionably music. The sound of a familiar tune could work miracles, cutting through the tension and exhaustion to momentarily lift the heaviest of hearts. Many ships, either officially or through the crew's own initiative, carried musical instruments. A fiddle or violin was a popular choice, its lively reels and jigs capable of inspiring energetic dancing on the deck, transforming the ship from a floating prison into a venue of celebration, if only for an evening. The accordion or concertina was another favorite, its sturdy construction able to withstand the harsh environment, and its rich, full sound perfect for group sing-alongs that could unite men of different backgrounds in a shared moment of nostalgia and comfort. Even something as simple as a set of bagpipes or a flute could provide a powerful connection to home, the melodies echoing across the empty ocean, serving as a defiant declaration of culture and identity in the face of the vast, impersonal unknown. For quieter moments, or for men who sought a more cerebral distraction, games of chance and strategy were a vital resource. Dice, carved from bone or ivory, were incredibly common artifacts found on shipwrecks. They were small, easy to store, and provided endless entertainment through simple games of luck that could turn a handful of nails or portions of rum into high-stakes wagers. Playing cards, though vulnerable to dampness, were also a treasured commodity. A well-worn deck, its faces softened by countless grimy fingers, represented hours of focused engagement. Games of whist, poker, or cribbage offered not just a pastime, but a mental challenge that could sharpen the mind and foster camaraderie and friendly competition among the crew. These games were more than mere diversions. They were social rituals that maintained the bonds between men, preventing the isolation from turning inward and festering into resentment or paranoia. But the most carefully regulated and universally issued morale booster was the daily ration of alcohol. This was not a luxury, it was a calculated tool of management. As we discussed, it served the practical purpose of purifying water, but its psychological role was equally critical. The daily tot of rum in the British Navy, or the ration of wine or beer on other vessels, was a fixed point in the endless cycle of days, a small but guaranteed moment of warmth and relief. It was a ritual that broke up the monotony, a token from the captain that acknowledged the crew's hardship and offered a tangible reward for their labor. In the bitter cold of the Southern Ocean or the stifling heat of the doldrums, that swallow of spirits was a physical comfort, easing aching muscles and numbing the constant anxieties of life at sea. It lubricated social interactions, allowing men to grumble and laugh together, venting pressures that might otherwise build towards mutiny. The loss of the alcohol supply was considered a catastrophic event not just for hydration, but because a sober crew was often a sullen, discontented, and dangerously clear-eyed crew. A wise captain knew that morale was the glue that held the entire enterprise together. A discontented crew could easily transform from a disciplined unit into a mob, and history is littered with expeditions that ended in mutiny because the commander failed to tend to the psychological well-being of his men. The items packed for morale, the fiddle, the dice, the rum, were therefore not indulgences. They were essential instruments of command, as vital to the ship's safety as any cannon or compass. They were the tangible expression of a profound truth understood by the most successful explorers, that to conquer the greatest oceans on Earth, you first had to master the treacherous seas of the human heart. The meticulous ledgers and carefully stowed barrels of the great explorers were not just relics of their time. They were the foundational blueprints for every modern journey into the unknown. The same core principles that guided Magellan's Carax and Cook's Endeavour are now hardwired into the most ambitious missions of our era, from the vacuum of space to the sheer faces of the world's highest peaks. While the materials and technology have evolved beyond recognition, the fundamental logic of preparing for the unimaginable remains a constant, proving that human ingenuity, when faced with the void, follows a very familiar playbook. Perhaps the most direct descendant of the wooden sailing ship is the International Space Station. This marvel of engineering is, in essence, the ultimate exploration vessel, a completely self-sufficient habitat on a years-long voyage into the most hostile environment humanity has ever encountered. Every single item on board, from a high-tech experiment to a toothbrush, had to earn its place during a packing process far more rigorous than any Royal Spanish port official could have imagined. The modern equivalent of the ship's Cooper is the teams of engineers who design the cargo modules for resupply spacecraft like SpaceX's Dragon or Northrop Grumman's Cygnus. Their challenge is identical to that of their historical counterparts, maximizing every cubic inch of space while perfectly balancing the load to ensure the spacecraft's stability during its perilous journey. A miscalculation in weight distribution on a rocket is just as catastrophic as a top-heavy ship capsizing in a storm. The legacy of the explorer's diet is also alive and well, having undergone a revolution in preservation science. The salt pork and weevil-ridden hardtack of old have been replaced by NASA freeze-dried and thermostabilized meals. Yet the goal is precisely the same: to provide maximum nutrition and caloric density in the smallest, lightest, and most shelf-stable package possible. Each meal is meticulously planned and packaged, a direct evolution from the daily rations measured out by a ship's purser. Even the problem of morale, so keenly addressed by captains with a daily tot of rum, is tackled with similar psychological insight. Space agencies know that the monotony of a long-duration mission can be debilitating, so they pack comfort foods like tortillas instead of crumbly bread that could float into sensitive equipment, or occasional treats like chocolate or candy to provide a crucial mental boost, much like cooks' savvy use of sauerkraut as a coveted luxury. This principle of redundancy, of packing for failure, is another thread that connects Captain Bligg to Captain Kirk. On a sailing ship, the loss of a mast meant deploying the carpenters and breaking out the spare timbers lashed to the deck. On a spacecraft, the failure of a critical system means relying on backup modules and spare parts that are either stored on board or delivered on subsequent resupply missions. The entire logistics chain of the ISS, with its carefully scheduled cargo launches, is the modern equivalent of a planned resupply stop at a remote island, a lifeline that ensures the voyage can continue even when the unexpected occurs. The same historical lessons are applied with equal rigor on Earth by those who push the limits of extreme mountaineering and polar exploration. A climber attempting to summit Mount Everest is engaging in a logistical exercise that would be deeply familiar to Ernest Shackleton. Their backpack is their ship's hold, and every single gram is a calculated trade-off. The modern alpinist's down suit, Gore-Tex shell, and lightweight alloy climbing hardware are the direct descendants of the layered woolens, oilskins, and forged iron tools of early 20th century explorers. The goal is identical: to create a portable micro-environment that protects against a hostile climate, using the most advanced materials available. The planning for a high-altitude expedition mirrors the old naval manifests, just on a smaller scale. Calories are counted with the same obsession, prioritizing high-energy, low-weight foods like nuts, chocolate, and specially formulated energy gels, the pemmican of the 21st century. Redundancy is baked into every system. A climber will carry a backup stove, extra fuel, a second headlamp, and duplicate gloves because, in the death zone, a single equipment failure is a death sentence. This meticulous duplication is the same philosophy that compelled ships to carry extra sails and miles of spare rope. Furthermore, the strategy of establishing a series of stocked camps up the mountain is a direct parallel to the historic practice of laying down depots of supplies on the ice for the return journey. A lesson learned through the tragic failures of those like Scott of the Antarctic, who underestimated its importance. Whether the destination is the Martian surface or the summit of K2, the spirit of those early packers lives on. The unknown will always demand the same response: meticulous planning, ruthless prioritization, and an unwavering respect for the fragility of human life in the face of immense power. The barrels of sauerkraut are now vacuum-sealed pouches. The astrolabe is a GPS satellite, and the ship's forge is a 3D printer capable of manufacturing a replacement part on demand. But the essential calculation remains unchanged. It is the timeless practice of looking into the abyss and deciding, with careful thought and profound hope, what to bring along for the ride. Now, let's turn the tables and put you in the shoes of one of these great adventurers. Imagine you're standing on the dock, looking at your ship. It's not a massive vessel, and you know every single inch of storage space is already accounted for with the absolute essentials: food, water, spare sails, and ammunition. But your captain has granted you a tiny concession, one small, lockable personal chest. You get to choose just 5 items to fill it, not 5 categories, 5 specific things. What do you take? This isn't about survival in the basic sense. The ship's communal supplies cover that. This is about what will keep you sane, safe, and successful on a journey that will stretch for years into the absolute unknown. Your choices reveal your priorities, your fears, and your personality in a way nothing else can. The first thing any seasoned traveler would tell you is to prioritize a high-value trade multiplier. You need something small, lightweight, and virtually indestructible that holds immense perceived value to cultures you've never encountered. Those colorful glass beads and simple iron nails we talked about were revolutionary technology to the people who received them. So what's the modern equivalent? Perhaps a compact but high-quality multi-tool made of polished stainless steel. To a society working with stone or bone, its various blades, screwdrivers, and pliers would seem like magic. Or maybe a magnifying glass. Its ability to concentrate sunlight to start a fire or to reveal microscopic details would be a source of wonder and power. This single item could be your key to bargaining for fresh food, clean water, safe passage, or crucial local knowledge. It's not for you, it's your passport and your currency rolled into one. Next, you have to think about documentation and adding value to the expedition. A captain values a crew member who contributes beyond basic labor. So, do you pack a blank, waterproof journal and a supply of permanent ink cartridges? Your detailed sketches of coastlines, plants, and animals could become the only record if the official logs are lost. Your written account of interactions with local leaders could provide invaluable diplomatic insights for those who follow. Or perhaps you focus on communication, bringing a device that feels like magic even today. A simple hand crank radio. Beyond catching distant signals, its ability to record and play back sound could be an unbelievable tool for learning languages and building trust. You could record a chief's greetings and play them for the next village down the coast. A powerful demonstration of respect and peaceful intent. Then there's the question of personal comfort and mental preservation. The sea is a relentless grind of monotony broken by moments of sheer terror. What one item will anchor you to your humanity? For some, it might be a musical instrument, a durable ocarina or a small flute. The ability to create music, to lead a shanty that lifts the crew's spirits, makes you an asset to everyone's morale. For others, it might be a single, cherished book, its pages filled with familiar poetry or philosophy, to be read and reread until the binding falls apart. It's a window back to your world and a shield against the creeping loneliness. This isn't a frivolous choice. It's preventative medicine for the soul, a vital tool for maintaining the psychological stamina needed to face each new day. Of course, you must also consider pure, practical utility. A reliable way to tell time independently of the ship's bells, like a robust mechanical watch, could be crucial if you're separated during a landing party. A high-quality whetstone to keep every blade on board, your own, your mates', even the cook's razor sharp speaks to a pragmatic mindset that values preparedness and self-reliance. Or perhaps you think about health, packing a sealed kit with modern seeds for fast-growing, nutrient-rich greens like spinach or kale. Convincing the captain to let you set up a small, ongoing garden in a stored wooden tub could provide the entire crew with a continuous, tiny supplement of fresh vitamins. A personal project that fights scurvy and earns you immense goodwill. Ultimately, the exercise forces you to confront the same brutal trade-offs every explorer faced. Do you choose the item that benefits the entire mission, the one that ensures your personal well-being, or the object that might save your life in a crisis? There are no right answers, only calculated gambles. Your 5 items paint a portrait of who you are as an explorer: the diplomat, the scribe, the medic, the musician, or the pragmatist. And that's the final, most profound lesson hidden in the hold of every ship that ever sailed off the map. The greatest resource they carried wasn't a thing you could pack in a chest at all. It was the diversity of human spirit, a collection of different priorities and skills that, when combined, created a whole far greater than the sum of its parts, capable of achieving the impossible. So when we step back and look at the full picture, from the salt-caked barrels of beef to the gleaming brass sextants, what we're really seeing is a breathtaking symphony of foresight. These packing lists were far more than simple inventories. They were intricate blueprints for survival and success, meticulously drafted against a backdrop of sheer uncertainty. Every item, from the lowliest nail to the most delicate chronometer, represented a calculated decision in a high-stakes equation where a single miscalculation could mean disaster. The themes we've traveled through: the science of sustenance, the precision of navigation, the psychology of trade, and the raw grit of survival weren't isolated chapters. They were interlocking systems, each one relying on the others to function. You couldn't use your navigational tools if scurvy had debilitated your crew, and your trade goods were worthless if your ship couldn't stay afloat long enough to reach a trading partner. This was holistic planning at its most profound, a testament to the human mind's ability to anticipate the needs of the body and the challenges of an unseen world. These explorers, in essence, were building a small, mobile world within the wooden walls of their ship, a self-contained bubble of their own culture and technology designed to endure years away from its source. The packing list was the recipe for that world. It was a document of hope, a declaration that they intended not only to venture into the void, but to return from it, forever altering humanity's understanding of its home. The incredible ingenuity on display, from preserving lemon juice to prevent disease to suspending a clock in gimbals to keep perfect time, shows us that exploration has never been just about courage. It has always been, at its heart, a monumental feat of logistics. It was the quiet, careful work of planners and thinkers that made the heroic moments of discovery possible, proving that the greatest adventures are won not just with boldness, but with preparation. This spirit of ingenious preparation is the direct ancestor of every modern mission, from the depths of the ocean to the surface of Mars. The same principles of redundancy, nutrition, psychological support, and tool specialization guide the packing of a space station module today, just as they guided the stowage of a 17th century galleon. The challenges may change, but the essential human endeavor remains the same: to look into the vast unknown and decide what to bring along for the ride. It connects us directly to those sailors of old, reminding us that our desire to discover, to map, and to understand is a fundamental part of who we are. Now we want to hear from you. If you were setting sail on a 3-year voyage into the unknown, with all the basic survival gear already covered, what 5 personal items would you absolutely insist on having in your sea chest? Would you choose something for practical utility, for morale, for trade, or for documentation? Share your own perfect historical packing list in the comments below. We can't wait to see the ingenious ideas you come up with. And if you enjoyed unraveling this historical mystery with us, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell for more deep dives into the forgotten details that shaped our world. Until next time, fair winds.